Hi, welcome. And my name is Ruth McCambridge. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Nonprofit Quarterly. And thank you for coming this afternoon. As I imagine most of us are trying to recover from whatever psychic damage we might have sustained during the debate last night. But as songwriter Joe Hill might admonish us, don't mourn, organize. So what can we learn today or even relearn about reframing social issues before, during, and after an election? We think it's a lot, and we think we have the perfect person to talk to us about that today. To explore the topic, we have master tracker of the public narrative in Julie Sweetland of the Frameworks Institute, which the MacArthur Foundation recognized last year for its genius as an institution. But before I move on, I want to make sure that you all know our sponsor, because that is how you are able to come to this session for free today. Our sponsor is QGive, and it helps nonprofits raise more money with an easy-to-use fundraising platform. There are different tools and features like donation pages, mobile forms, peer-to-peer events, and more are designed with fundraising best practices in mind. Raising money online or on the go is easy for nonprofits, no matter how big or small. QGive has the right solution for you. If you're ready to simplify your online fundraising, check them out. To tweet, we do like to ask people to share whatever it is that we do, just to make sure that our work, the work gets as wide an audience as possible. So to tweet along with the program today, we have hashtag Julie Reframing Social Issues, which is pretty straightforward over here, and just help us get the word out, because that's going to allow people to come back and see the presentation later. And then that answers another question that we get all the time. So don't ask me this question while the webinar is going on, which is, will you be able to access this material later? Yes, 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 we will send it to you. And you can actually use that link to share it with other people. We are going to invite questions after Julie finishes a 40-minute discussion with us, but that you can basically ask your questions during the presentation on the lower right hand of your screen. Just whenever you hear something that you have a question about, go ahead and write it in right then. I'm going to keep an eye on it, and at the end of Julie's presentation, I will pick and choose and ask her the questions which seem, most pertinent. So now on to the presentation. Julie Sweetland is a social linguist and vice president for strategy and innovation at Frameworks Institute. Since joining in 2012, she's provided strategic communications guidance for advocates, policymakers, scientists nationwide and internationally. Julie Sweetland on reframing issues.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for the opportunity to have such a timely conversation. It's always great to be able to work with Nonprofit Quarterly to really bring innovative thinking to the nonprofit sector. Before I get going, I just want to say a few words about Frameworks Institute and who we are. We are a nonprofit think tank based in DC. We've got a staff of about 20 folks whose work I'm drawing on today. We work as a team. Most of us are PhD level social scientists. So as Ruth mentioned, I happen to be a linguist. We have a few other linguists on staff. We also have anthropologists, political scientists, psychologists, and sociologists. Together, we investigate the communications aspects of various social justice and scientific issues. So children's issues, the economy and inequality, human rights issues such as immigration or criminal justice, the environment, so on and so forth. We use an empirical process, pulling methods from across our disciplines to deeply study what frames work, which don't, and why. And we publish the findings of our studies on our website. which is open to the nonprofit sector. The findings are freely available. And we also maintain a team that helps nonprofits use this work, so offering training, consulting, or review of communications that we call frame checks. So we do work on social issues, not political or electoral campaigns, but because political discourse constrains and shapes issues, we pay close attention to what happens in campaign seasons and in political rhetoric overall. And I'm going to structure our conversation today according to a text that we return to often here at Frameworks. This is from the Political Parables for Today by Robert Reich, former U.S. Secretary of Labor and now a professor of public policy at Berkeley and a widely regarded political commentator. This was an op-ed that was published in 1985, but it couldn't be more timely. It offers an incredibly apt and elegant way of parsing and unpacking and just diagnosing the rhetoric that surrounds us in this campaign season and pretty much every campaign season, as well as political discourse, any year, whether it's divisible by 4 or not. He points out that familiar parables shape this discourse. Every American retells and listens to these stories. Every politician and social commentator borrows from them, embellishes from them, and seeks legitimacy from them. I'll just add here that the fact that these parables, as he terms it, are stories, in fact, their narratives really matter. They have coherent and familiar structures. The characters are recognizable. There are predictable slots for the heroes and for the villains. The plots have tension, there are conflicts that must be resolved, but crucially, we know how the story starts and we know how these stories end. The durability and ubiquity of these narratives means, among other things, that they don't always have to be told in full. Just as I can mention glass slippers and you can call to mind instantly the full story of Cinderella, or at least recognize that tale, there are familiar images and bits of language that tap into these narratives, and it's that kind of analysis that I hope to add to the parables framework today. So, the first one, the triumphant individual narrative. This is one that is likely already very familiar to, whether or not you've read this original article. This is the story of the little person who works hard and submits to self-discipline and is eventually rewarded with fame and fortune. We're moving on up from the Jeffersons. We started at the bottom, now we're here from a contemporary rap song. This is a story told again and again across American culture. The driver of this upward mobility is individual effort, skill, and will. The determinant of success isn't privilege, it's actually sacrifice and going without. It isn't pre-existing station in life, it's risking one's position, risking it all for the big payoff. And in the story, even though we all know the end of the story, in the world of the story itself, the outcome isn't known. It's not clear that the person will succeed. In fact, within the story world, it's unlikely. Rags shouldn't predict riches. Our unlikely hero in the story has to prevail against the odds. This is such a foundational narrative in American culture that political candidates feel compelled to tell it. Even when Cinderella's slipper doesn't fit, the political figures try it on. And when this tale doesn't fit their own circumstances, it can lead to humorous results. So we can see this in two gaffes of the current campaign and earned this year's major party candidates, a bit of ridicule. Trump asserting that he got started with a, quote, small loan of only $1 million, and Clinton in her autobiography describing her family's financial situation in the year 2000 as, quote, unquote, dead broke. If you watched the debate last night, so those are two, kind of funny examples that garnered some laughs, on late night TV and so on and so forth. But if you watched the debate last night, you could see the candidates pulling from this narrative in more serious ways. Secretary Clinton took pains to describe her father's work as a textile laborer and really showed that she came from humble beginnings in that way. And Trump talked about building his company over time, putting in energy and effort. So again, this is American politicians feel compelled to really identify with Americans in this worldview in this way. So That's perhaps not that surprising, but what might be more interesting is how it gets told lots of different ways. There are many ways to fill in this parable or call on it through cue words like the glass slippers pulling up the whole tale of Cinderella. Language like hardworking Americans, or calling out that everyone who works hard and plays by the rules, or even talking about and lionizing or elevating small business owners. These are all ways that people tap into this sense that there are people who are striving and putting in effort, and in the end, will have upward mobility as a result. So politicians try to adopt this uniquely American identity. They also reflect it back to Americans or voters as a way to illustrate that they share this worldview. What's interesting to me as a nonprofit communicator is how we as a sector participate in this narrative too. So many of us are sensitized to the fact that the bootstraps narrative leaves a lot out. By saying that a person can succeed if only they try. We're obscuring the role that social context and structural conditions can play in shaping life's trajectories and outcomes. But we often tell a story of a person who starts with little, but through their pluck, their own pluck makes good. When nonprofit communicators work to demonstrate the worthiness of people who benefit from their programs or proposed policy, then they're tapping into this. If we're telling the story of the person who's working 3 jobs but still couldn't make it, that pulls from this narrative. When we highlight individuals whose experiences run counter to the stereotype, that's talking about that red balloon in the picture there too. To give some examples, a star student from the inner city, maybe you're highlighting someone like that, that's only an interesting story because we share a common cultural understanding that students in that setting aren't academically strong. Again, I'm not saying that's the truth of the matter, but that's the cultural stereotype or default understanding. If we tell a story, same thing for the single mother who took temporary assistance but then moved on to quote unquote self-sufficiency by getting a degree and landing a stable job, or the person with a disability who contributes to their community in myriad and surprising ways. If you fill in your mold breaker here, just know that you're pulling from this narrative. When we foreground the stories of people who aren't at all what you'd expect based on their perceived social station, whether that's race or class or ability status or age, we're implicitly affirming that that social station has the meaning that's routinely ascribed to it. So just a caution there. The second narrative in Reicher's analysis is the rot at the top narrative. This parable is about bad actors, and those bad actors are powerful elites. They can be wealthy aristocrats, rapacious business leaders, or imperious government officials. The moral of this is clear. Americans must not allow any privileged group to get too much power. Again, this has a long history in American political discourse. We got the picture here of the jungle by Upton Sinclair, really talking about bad business practices and how they affect people around us. In the current campaign season, I saw this quite a bit in both Donald Trump's rhetoric, but Bernie Sanders. Most of the pundits that I've seen, were puzzling at the rise of these two campaigns early in the primary season, and they talked about the common thread between Trump and Sanders as being both quote-unquote outsider candidates. My own take on this is that they were both tapping into very explicitly and very effectively this rot at the top narrative. Trump, of course, points to the rot at the top as politicians. The people who are rigging it are insiders keeping themselves in power. And Sanders pointed to the rot at the top as the ultra wealthy who were eager to maintain their wealth and rigging the power structures to do it. So they were actually both telling the same story, although filling in the villain with different characters. Now when this narrative has government cast as the villain, it rests on certain patterns of thinking that are deeply embedded in American culture. And I'm drawing now from research that We Have Frameworks did back in 2004, sponsored by Demos, and also subsequent work supported by grants from the MacArthur Foundation. Um, so a few things here, and it also goes back to the kind of unexpected rise of both the Trump and the Bernie Sanders campaign. First is this understanding that politicians are corrupt, that they are more interested in money and maintaining the donor class or making money through some sort of nefarious means. And both campaigns had a way of negating this sense, right? So if you're funding your campaign at $27 a pop, then you can't be corrupted by big money interests. And if you're worth $9 billion and self-funding your campaign, then you also can't be corrupted. Those are the claims of those campaigns and how they work to position the candidate in a very positive light in the public mind. The other one is that politicians are self-interested. It's not so much that they're after money per se, but they want to get reelected. They want to maintain their position and their power. So there are ways to mute this model or really become not a politician, right, by not doing this in the public mind. So if you sound folksy and you've said the exact same thing for 30, 40 years in public service, and you sound plain and quite frankly not very smooth and glib, but maybe a little cranky, little finger in your eye, then that says you're not only saying what people want to hear, you're not pandering to people, therefore you are not self-interested, therefore we can trust you. So that's how that works. Same thing, a similar outcome, similar underlying way of understanding it with very different rhetoric is working in Mr. Trump's favor. So if you say outrageous things, you say things that are not typically heard by, in public discourse, if you will speak the unspeakable, consequences be damned, then you must not be self-interested, right? If you don't care what people think about you, then you must really be speaking the truth and not so much worried about that. And so I think that's one way of understanding why some very inflammatory rhetoric has actually not backfired on this particular candidate. The other thing that comes with the rot at the top narrative is that politics is just arguments. It's just self-interested, corrupt people saying whatever they need to say, to manipulate the public into taking their side. That all social issues are really just political footballs. And this one is really toxic in terms of depressing public interest in issues as opposed to building engagement. People will tune this out as soon as they kind of hear a conversation as being partisan in nature, as it's not seen to be authentic discourse. And then the other thing that happens in this rot at the top is it draws on why government can be put into that role, and when it's in that role, why that works so well, is this sense of government being bloated, slow, ineffective, bureaucratic, wasteful. This guy on top of the big snail. And that is contrasted with business. Which is in contrast, seems to be the opposite. So business is slow, government is slow, business is quick, nimble, can take advantage, it's poised to really move things. Where government is bloated, too many workers, too much waste, business is seen as lean, mean, focused on the bottom line, just making do with exactly what it needs. And where government is seen as not being able to solve problems, by contrast, business is seen as being very successful, able to design a strategy and make a plan that works. So that contrast we saw being pulled on last night in Trump's rhetoric. Trump called Clinton a politician 11 times. Sometimes he explicitly said that her many years as a politician had come to nothing, right? So you've been working on this for 30 years, you haven't solved it. He kind of ran that through a couple times, but most of the time he didn't even have to tease that out, he could just use the word politician. And why does that work? Because it's tapping into this sense of government, anyone in this government as being, kind of on this snail. This is also why it seems to be so effective when he touts his wealth, right? So he's automatically putting himself on that side. His business is effective, and he's explicitly making that argument that we need somebody who knows this kind of thinking to get inside government. Right. The next, the third of the four, and I'll talk about, is the mob at the gates. This parable is about the social disintegration that lurks just below the surface of democracy. It's mob rule, violence, crime, society coming apart by outsiders coming in and exploiting our freedom, our openness. And the moral of this story is that we must impose social discipline lest the rabble overrun us. I think this is the narrative that has been very salient to people in the Trump campaign and has attracted many and been a source of serious concern for others. I just want to point out that this narrative is not new. This one is enduring and old. The illustration that I have there is just past the turn of the 20th century. It's the first couple years of the 1900s is when that picture is from. This is a story that we have been telling in America for quite some time. We do know that it's present in today's campaign. This is the divisive rhetoric that's attracted a lot of attention. It was perfectly modeled in Trump's opening statements last night. And I'll just read here, and you can see if you can see this narrative. Our jobs are fleeing the country. They're going to Mexico. They're going to many other countries. You look at what China is doing to our country in terms of making our product. They're devaluing their currency, and there's nobody in our government to fight them. And we have a very good fight. We have a winning fight, because they're using our country as a piggy bank to rebuild China, and many other countries are doing the same thing. So he opened with the mob at the gates being global competition, but at other points in the campaign it has been not merely governments doing things unfairly in terms of trade, but immigrants, particularly from Mexico, in his telling. So we're under siege. Let's land on law and order. We saw him talk about that and pull these things in. In the campaigns, again, but again, this is not new. In campaigns past, the mob at the gates has already been within our borders. In previous campaigns, this spot, the mob, has been filled in with various unsavory and unfairly characterized characters. So these are not my words, but the words from previous campaigns: welfare queens, drug lords, gangbangers, super predators, and the 47% have all at various times been the mob. We might call that version the mob within our gates. There were echoes of that particular, the mob within our gates, in Trump's comments on race last night. We need law and order. If we don't have it, we're not going to have our country. In our inner cities, African Americans and Hispanics are living in hell because it's so dangerous. You walk down the street and you get shot. So they're the mob at the gates, this unruly character set of society that is causing violence and crime, or actually other people of color within our own communities. But this again, because this narrative is enduring and told over time, that is part of the place where it gets its power at other points in our country, right? They've been, superpowers that we fought, the Japanese, the Nazis, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a narrative that gets told again and again. So of these three, the moral of most of these stories leads away from nonprofits' worldview. So I've gone through three of these narratives, and before I go through the fourth, I want to offer a peek into the underlying structure of these. If we plot these according to two features, are they about the few or the many? And are they about hope or fear? We can see how they cover the terrain of American political discourse. So we as nonprofits have missions that assume that the community has needs that are met by not by individuals, but by groups like our organizations. And we have legal statuses, tax code, that acknowledges that this work is in the common interest for the public good in some way. So this fourth narrative The benign community, that's about hope for the many, is the one that works best for nonprofits. But let me sum up, before I move on to that, why these other three can have undesirable effects and unintended consequences. When we tap into the triumphant individual, about the hope for the few, we affirm in some way the belief that work and striving are a direct measure. They are exactly equatable to a measure of one's worthiness or value. In turn, this undermines the idea that all humans have innate value, or that there are things that are valuable regardless of their utility, such as our natural environment or other species. When we tap into right at the top, it's very easy for Americans to slip into well-worn and familiar ways of thinking about government. Public servants can be branded as mere politicians interested in their own careers and campaign coffers. Discussion of our public affairs are recoded as just politics as usual, self-interested people trying only to manipulate the facts to their own worldview and the unwitting public along with them. The mob at the gates narrative that outsiders are somehow exploiting, the others are exploiting America and threatening Americans, that prods Americans to hunker down and protect what they have at all costs. Those of us who need and want or believe in talking about sharing, embracing, and including others, no matter who those others may be, are painted as overly permissive and foolish. We are letting wolves in sheep's clothing into our fold, and we are endangering the entire flock. So these three narratives, even if there are parts of them that seem to be quite helpful to making the case for the work that we all do, they bring with them some undesirable frame effects. I find this four-square box incredibly useful for understanding how candidates and campaigns are positioning themselves. You can fit pretty much everything they say into one of these four boxes. But one term that came up about a half dozen times last night, I couldn't figure out quite where I thought it was going or coming from, and that's the term middle class. Is that saying that these folks have triumphed? Their hard work has paid off? They've earned that position? Is it a mob at the gates kind of thing? Is the middle class is inside the gates and outsiders like the poor, are threatening their sort of standard of living by taking, from them in terms of the tax benefit or benefits and taxes? Or is it a right at the top narrative that either business is squeezing these folks or government taxes are keeping them down? So if you have a thought as to where you think middle class fits, send it to it in the chat or send it in a question, and that might make for some good discussion. All right, so these are the stories they're telling and that we hear repeatedly. Why? I'm not going to talk about where these come from, but why it's so effective to pull on narratives like these, particularly for electoral candidates for office. So what's good for candidates can be bad for issues, and this is a bit of a cautionary tale that's simply mimicking what we see working, quote unquote working, in the political sphere will definitely work for those of us who are working within longer term movements. So I think it's important for us to draw some distinctions between what elections are about and what social issue evolution needs to do. So an election is, by definition, a short-term, zero-sum, all-or-nothing affair. They have a clear endpoint, Election Day, where the winner gets all the rewards and the loser goes home with nothing or less than nothing because their political future is diminished. Winning campaigns, therefore, have some communication strategies that take those things as givens. They rely on a short but intense burst of very expensive messaging. Not only does this mean that candidates' interests are irrevocably tied to donors and fundraising, it also means that a sort of scorched earth messaging strategy is the sole route to success. Campaign messages focus on immediate change. They have nothing to gain by dissenting views or otherwise supporting minority-held views. These messages also tend to rely on emotional appeals, especially fear and other negatives. Tactically, elections are all about defining the electorate. The aim is to identify the persuadable, the roughly 20% of the electorate who swing between parties. These voters are the only ones that are amenable to short-term persuasion. Because elections are won by getting just one more vote than an opponent in a decision arena, candidates' only option is to hone in on individual targets in swing districts. Candidates actually want to turn off voters who are inclined toward the other side, either hoping that they won't vote or actively pursuing ways to ensure they won't. Put simply, a vote lost to your opponent, if you can stop someone from voting to your opponent, it's just as good as getting them to vote for you. And so, not surprisingly, candidates often resort to negative advertising or even just divisive rhetoric to drive up their opponents' dislikes and reduce the electorate. The upshot is that campaign effects happen quickly, but they also tend to burn out quickly. The election, in terms of those ideas, don't necessarily have a lot of staying power, but it does have this effect, that the election leaves citizens overwhelmed, exhausted, and disinterested. Now, that's kind of the exact opposite of what those of us in the nonprofit sector need to accomplish in order to build an ever-increasing level of awareness and support for issues. We have very different goals, very different means, and ideally very different results from electoral politics. So in social issues, the messaging is about long-term political change, and there's no end date. Rather, we're more in a constantly evolving attempt to better society and solve socio-political problems. In our process, the losers aren't sent home. Rather, persuasion attempts to bring them into the fold as part of the solution. We have a focus on incremental change and bringing everyone to the table. And this can turn politics into an inclusive, positive-sum game. Winning an issue campaign, or a winning issue campaign, is based on a small but steady stream of messages that work through buildup, through accretion, to really shift and rebuild the cognitive underpinnings of the public's decision making. This tends to be less expensive than the equivalent electoral campaign, and the effects actually can be greater. Issue evolution is an educative process that depends on building and sustaining interest for the long haul. And so this rules out a message strategy based on negative appeals. It opens up space for dissent, for the inclusion and the pressing of minority-held views that are necessary for democracy. And our communications and outreach effects don't happen in short, intense bursts. They tend to accumulate over time. They slowly build an avalanche of citizen interest. And the support isn't a one-time, on a specific day, do this kind of action, like a vote. The act of support is based on acquired knowledge, and it forms a much stronger base for all types of actions in a more kind of a ongoing proposal, evaluation of the proposals that come before us. So issue evolution is a more open game. It assumes that people are reasonable, open to any effective messages, and that means we need to take the time to find messages that can influence lots of Americans, regardless of political affiliation. It's important to try to embrace and attract everyone except for the most extreme 5% or so. So at Frameworks, we take this approach. When we look for frames that work, one of the ways we define work is whether it can move multiple audiences, whether it can help people across party affiliations distinguish between meaningful changes and disproven or mismatched policies. And when we see movement across the board in a survey, we know that these frames are movement builders. They can become the underpinning of a big tent communication strategy that invites people to get smarter about the issue. So campaigns are doing a lot of damage, typically, to the political discourse, or to our socio-political discourse. They almost always leave scorched earth. And this one that we're in right now, in particular, is destined to be among the most negative that we have seen in recent U.S. political memory. It's up to nonprofits to cultivate a positive discourse again, to rebuild trust, rebuild a productive conversation around social issues, to seed the ideas that need to take root, bud, and blossom in American discussion of the problems that face us. Now, this is by choice, a fantastical kind of image to kind of make the point of the contrast between what electoral campaigns must accomplish and what nonprofits can aspire to accomplish. But lest this seem too airy-fairy or idealistic, I want to point out one moment from last night's debate that to my ears was absolutely shocking. It didn't seem to make it into post-debate chatter, but I found it quite telling. I read before from Trump's opening statement where he talked about China and Mexico taking our jobs and our factories. But he then moved on, this candidate from the right, took pains to point out that an area of common ground between his campaign and the left's was the importance of early childhood policy. As far as childcare is concerned, he said, and so many other things, I think Hillary and I agree on that. We probably disagree a little bit as to numbers and amounts and what we're going to do, but perhaps we'll be talking about that later. That was a stunning moment because 20 years ago, early childhood was not even an issue that was on the political agenda. It was considered a babysitting problem, a private affair. Yet now it is an issue of such political salience that it is something that unlikely supporters are scrambling to align with. There are even polls that suggest that early childhood policy has become a voting issue, which is remarkable. It's, to put something as a voting issue is really a heavy lift. So this is a tree that has been cultivated over time by a network of organizations, by a movement with effective frames. These are organizations like the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, the Alliance for Early Success, the Alliance for Strong Families and Communities, the Kids Count Network, and more. These organizations have aligned around shared frames that tell a story that the nation has a shared stake in the early years of children's lives, that those early years matter, that they matter in a particular way, and that they have effects that have consequences for us all. That broad movement of scientists and children's advocates have really moved this issue in very obvious ways. This is an issue that's been a centerpiece of several State of the Union addresses during the Obama administration. Now we even see it as an issue that the opposing party is trying to align with. So that's an example of what happens over the long term and how that can play into the short term. The way that happens is through our fourth narrative from Reich's analysis, the benign community narrative. This final parable is about the American community. It is a story of neighbors and friends rolling up their sleeves and pitching in to help one another, self-sacrifice, community pride, and patriotism, dependence, compassion. The principle here, the moral of this story, is that we must nurture and preserve genuine community. So campaign slogans often pull from the benign community narrative. So we can see here, stronger together. Hillary Clinton's official campaign slogan is definitely, it's a very pithy two-word execution, two-word version of that tale. And I've found myself oddly missing Mitt Romney recently. And his campaign slogan did the same thing, believe in America, right? It's tapping into the more America as a city on the hill, this benevolent community that we talk about as America. So these are present in discourse, but it takes much more than slogans to tell this particular narrative well, because although we can tap into it, this one does not get as many repetitions as the other three. So how do we tell this narrative well? One way is to stop telling the other narratives. Let's stop talking about our issues as problems that affect vulnerable population X. Let's stop doing the argument culture. These data prove what my side has been saying all along, and the other guys are definitely wrong. Let's stop system bashing. The system is broken, and sweeping changes are needed now. And also stop talking about things in ways that suggest that only the experts, only our leaders have a role to play, but rather this is a community thing that requires all hands on deck. So the kinds of larger frame that can help us tap into this and enliven and embody this benign community narrative is that, hey, this is a problem that faces all of us. This is a problem with a system that we have built that should be contributing to a functioning society. And let me show you how this works. hey, America, here's what's going on, and here's my data that support this explanation. It's a more explanatory tone that cues that this is about civic problem solving. Let's talk about improvements being necessary and possible and yielding shared benefits, and that we can make adjustments, which can engender greater will to change things rather than saying a system is broken. And really talking about the way that the active and informed participants in our democracy of many types, elected and unelected, official role and unofficial roles, how are these folks working together, which allows people to see themselves as part of that. So this right side of the slide, I'm going to just give a couple of examples of how we can do that, and then we'll open it up for questions. So why should we not talk about problem X as something that affects population Y, but something that affects all of us? Well, one reason is we just see at frameworks that it often has the exact opposite effect. Empathy in as a communications cue doesn't always lead to empathy out as the effect of the communication. So a few experiments we run recently, we tried an appeal to compassion, and it had no effect on the public support for human services, funding, investing in a professionalization of the workforce. Talking about this work as important because of compassion was the same as saying nothing. And a study on how frames that could move children's issues, an appeal to vulnerability, talking about at-risk kids and kids as being particularly vulnerable to societal forces. It actually made Americans less likely to support funding for programs that could, prevention and protection. And our understanding is that people thought about vulnerable kids as because they've got bad parents who aren't doing their job, and so that dampened the sense that we need to add support for those groups. And an appeal to empathy in a study of how to build support for better treatment options for people with addictions actually made people more punitive, and this one was in Canada. And if empathy doesn't work with Canadians, it's definitely not working with Americans. That's my editorial comment, at least. All right, so we can collectivize the issue away from, hey, this is about sympathy for the few or concern for the few, and really, instead of telling a sympathy story, tell system stories. This is the type of narrative that political scientist Shanto Iyengar talks about as thematic stories, very broad and inclusive of social context. And not episodic, which are the familiar tales we're most likely to encounter in the news. Other thing is, I want to see none of this from you people on the editorial page, right? That you're writing about, people who agree with you as right and everyone else as idiots. We can all stop engaging in the argument culture again because it simply doesn't work. The social analysis behind that may be firm, but as a communications strategy, finger pointing, it actually activates confirmation bias. It sends people to their predefined political corners and out of the public square in that middle space where people can learn and consider things more fully. And then finally, we need to show people, finally we need to show people the moving parts of the systems and how a community or how we can come together to change things. Piven and Cloward in their classic work on social movements, poor people's social movements, said that the social arrangements that are ordinarily perceived as just and immutable must come to seem both unjust and mutable. Advocates are pretty practiced at pointing out the unjust bit. We can talk about how bad things are for how many people, but we don't always show how we can change these things. And explaining the systems that create and structure equity and opportunity is not easy. And so we try to make that easier at frameworks by developing and testing metaphors that show the moving parts on social issues. So if the dominant understanding is that success is about individual pluck and willpower, for human services, we've had them helped that field start to talk about their work as building well-being, and that the goal of human services is constructing well-being, and this includes a wide range of team members. communities, faith-based organizations, specialists in X, Y, and Z. But it shows that this is not something that happens on its own or naturally, and that well-being is a broad-based kind of idea. And so people can then start to see why we need programs and policies. People often, on the issue of immigration or the economy, people understand the economy to be natural and immutable. It just does what it does based on laws of nature. It is impervious to change or human intervention, and that it's a pie, it's a fixed pie. So it's possible to talk about the economy in a different way, that it's more like a sailboat that's moving, and it can move faster or slower based on choices we make with our policies. We can adjust our sails to be well positioned to embrace and include the energy of immigrants from other nations, or we can miss those opportunities. And so again, we can see how these things can be shifted. In general, I would say that our task as nonprofits is not to persuade the public that systems are broken. It's to convince them that through our actions they can be fixed, and to do that they need to see a point of intervention. So are just a couple of examples. I'll say in conclusion that science trumps storytelling instinct. When we guess about the stories we're telling, we might guess wrong, and we should know before we go. There's an empirical process for determining that the economy is more like a sailboat than it is like a pie. That's some of the work that we do here at Frameworks. And also, as sectors, we are stronger together when we share framing strategies. So I want to invite you to check out the communications toolkits and research reports that are designed to help nonprofit communicators fill out the benign community parable. We do the research to rigorously test different frame elements like values or examples or metaphors, and then share them on our website through ways that I think should be fairly accessible. Eager to see what people are asking, but I will leave you with this thought that our message is complicated rather than simple. It's longer rather than shorter, and it's contrary to rather than consistent with popular understanding. I think this explains the inexplicable popularity of certain proposals and candidates at this moment in our time. So this is from Larry Wallach and his colleagues. So what does this mean for us as progressives? This means that we have to explain, whereas our opponents have it easy. They just have to state. We need to change people's minds. They just need to reinforce what people already think. We need to emphasize shared responsibility. They just need to highlight personal choice. So shifting public thinking and moving forward is the more difficult of the two tasks of conservatives or backward-looking policies versus forward-looking policies. I hope that I've offered some ways of understanding the difficulty of that and pointed you some tools that can make that a little bit easier. So now I am dying to hear which square middle class goes in and what people think, and I'm going to change my screen just a little bit so I can see some of the questions. And Ruth, what do we got?
Okay, well, I mean, we've gotten a lot of questions, but please feel free still, any of you who continue to have questions, write them in, because this undoubtedly will not be the last webinar we do with you, Julie, with your permission. So we got a couple of questions at the very beginning of the webinar that asked how racism and sexism integrates into some of these dominant narratives. How does that happen? What are some of the ways that we can recognize that?
Yeah, so I think the main way it is that it often, the triumphant individual narrative, that understanding of individual decisions, characteristics, being the sole determinant of outcomes, of success, is one of the ways that racism or sexism or any other marginalization or oppression of other groups, that's one of the main ways it gets maintained. It's where part of its power comes from. So if we look at disparities data, we've tested this for data on African Americans particularly, that people explain away 99% of people are experiencing problem X. Well, 99% of the people must be doing the wrong thing, right? So for the nonprofit analyst, it says, well, clearly these numbers are so stark, these disparities are so stark that it has to be a structural issue. The public takes something very different from that if we don't explain how those disparities are being created. They say, well, that's because those people are not working hard, submitting to self-discipline, taking risks, having faith in themselves. And so those, we've seen this on people's understanding of different quote-unquote types for science and math, and how they explain away women's participation in those fields as well. That's just not their type. It's not they're drawn to that. And so the people will use this individual understanding, this sense of self-makingness, to put the other group as a violator of self-makingness, responsible for their own fates, and therefore unworthy of assistance or special attention.
Right. Okay, I just got one question that I have to give to you. So, do these principles apply only in public-facing communication or also to more knowledgeable audiences such as funders?
That is a good question. If you had said policymakers, I would have said they definitely still apply, because funders, here's what I'll say. When people are experts in an issue, then they often can be told a quote-unquote less framed narrative. And when they are experts in a process, be that the legislative process or the funding process, you have to assume that they're thinking quite a bit like members of the public. And so they would be reasoning in the same way about a particular issue that the public will.
Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you might give us some more examples, or at least one more example of the idea of issue evolution. I'm fascinated about, it used to be that everybody would say, well, you've got to have an elevator speech, you've got to have a bumper sticker. But what you're describing is really very different from that. Can you talk about a successful campaign where small but steady stream of messages has worked, and just, trace that a little bit for us?
Sure. Well, so I think the one that people are kind of sitting up and noticing right now is the quote-unquote rapid, almost complete overnight shift in our understanding of marriage equality. And I would say that one is, yes, there was a fast shift in some of the judicial positions on that. But that was a long time in the making, too. So people may have read kind of recent analysis that really talked about how even the more contemporary movement over the past 10 years or so, they had been handed 31 straight legislative defeats in ballot initiatives in different states, and they came back together and really carefully considered their framing, and moved more towards a story that was about same-sex couples are interested in being able to live out their love and commitment in the same way as the rest of us, which was a shift from same-sex couples are being denied rights, which was allowing the public to understand them as kind of as one of the mobs at the gate, right? That they're trying to get in and get the stuff that the rest of us take for granted, like tax exemptions and hospital visiting rights. So that was actually othering them. So that's, in the last 10 years or so. But before that, we had, how many times have people been out chanting, in quote unquote pointless, right? Pride parades, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. How many episodes of Will and Grace, did we all watch? That was an intentional move among advocates to push screenwriters to start writing in same-sex attracted couples or individuals, right, into popular culture. So I would say many of the things that seem to folks outside of movement as quote-unquote moving fast, that is actually the beneficiary of those on the ground deeply embedded in the issue, pushing those ideas out over time.
Right. Very interesting. In terms of one person asked, is there a bottom that you can see, a turning point for the level of discourse that's occurred during this campaign? Is there a way that nonprofits should be thinking about how to manage the conversations that have flowed from it?
I think that understanding that one, this particular divisive rhetoric is not new. It has a long history. All of the rhetoric has a long history. So please do not lose lose any more sleep than you were losing 3 years ago about the state of our discourse. I think that's one thing I would say. It is, we have seen a lot of very hopeful kind of framing and very astute social analysis come out in this campaign. We've also seen a lot of hateful and divisive rhetoric. Both have always been with us. But I think that the thinking about these issues are being, we're going to have to reroot themselves in scorched earth, right? And really thinking about more opportunities to showcase, to really find all of our best efforts to tell that benign community or benevolent community narrative. Don't play into hey, it's not mob at the gate. So I would say not arguing against, right? We don't need to rebut the unproductive narratives. We need to shift the discourse into the terrain that is hopeful and positive. Hope for the many is kind of that square. That's the corner we need to be playing in. So I would say, I guess I'd sum it up as take heart. This is not new. And we have a corner to play in. Play there. Don't spend your precious opportunities on rebutting unproductive things. Rather, pushing forward, new seeds that can take root.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And now I want to just ask you, because we've gotten a number of requests, for you to just give people a sense of where the primers might be on your website in terms of really beginning to take on a greater understanding of how to use these frames. Can you talk a little bit about, what are the 3 places that people should go on your website?
Mm-hmm. So, I thought I had that on here at some point. So I would say, oh wait, right here. So you can find the toolkits under Learn to Frame. And so under Learn to Frame, it's right on the top menu bar. And you can, I think you can train with frameworks, you can get our advice, and then there's a section that's about learn on your own. And those are just places that point you to toolkits or Frameworks Academy modules, which are online classes where you can work through an issue. So a lot of this work is issues for specific, right? So I think the last 5 toolkits we put out were on juvenile justice, human services, education, public health, a public health issue. All right, I can only remember the last 4, sorry. But you'll see them topically in that way. Also in that section, there's a section on storytelling, which is less issue specific. So we have a open source module called Wide Angle Lens, which really walks through how to shift from zoomed in stories on individuals to zoomed out stories about systems and structures without putting people to sleep. So that is something that's a really good starter. And then I would say go to the Contact Us spot and sign up for our newsletter. That's the best way to keep in touch with the studies that we're releasing at any given point. So we're working on probably 24 different projects right now, which will have, housing is something we just came out with. Just about to come out with something on economic integration. How can we make sure that our communities are including many different types of people, including people of different classes, and how can we talk about that in a productive way and not feed into narratives or policies that are about displacement of people of color. So there's stuff coming out, school discipline, we're just about to release something on that. So I'd say join our newsletter to kind of stay on top of it. And we have a very, you only asked for 3 places, but I would also say on Twitter, we've got a very saucy Twitter feed, so you should follow that.
Perfect. And we are just about at time. I very much apologize to the many people who wrote in questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. We will follow up with Julie and with frameworks to see what else we can cook up for you. And, you know, I do want to say to you, Julie, we have gotten more absolutely rave reviews for this than we have gotten for just about any other webinar. So please feel free, you guys, to log in your rave reviews or your criticisms, and we will take them under advisement as we develop our next set. Thank you so much, Julie. This has been wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you, Ruth, and thank you to everyone who took some time out of their world-changing work to pause and reflect on the language that surrounds us. It warms a linguist's heart.
Okay. Talk to you later, and thank you very much, everybody, for attending.